Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. Now, during the early 90s, I'd gotten back into Skeletrix racing for a third time, and at that time I was big into HO racing. I've still got all that stuff. Maybe I'll show it to you guys one day in a video, but like I say, in the early 90s I had a bit of a sideline for the Skeletrix as well. Now, in that collection of cars I had one of these, the Skeletrix C120 Brabham, and at the time that car was a monster around my track. Of course, back in those days, the tyres would have been fresher, the motor would have been fresher, everything was just better. So this car was an absolute monster on the track. But sadly, all that Skeletrix stuff was all sold, ready for the fourth wave, which would come in the early 2000s. But that's another story again. So, speed up to today. We've got Swift Slots, which is where I tune all these cars and make them go better. Now, I had thought to myself, I wonder if I could have that old Brabham back. Could I make that car go even faster now than what it was back in the early 90s? So I went to the Slot Car Fest this year, 2025, and I started grubbing through all the boxes around the show, and in one of the boxes I found this, a nice C120 Skeletrix Brabham, and it was only £5, so about $6. So I grabbed it, and then I went shopping for all the extra parts. So let's get you on my table. I'll show you this car and I'll show you the parts that I've got, and once we've built this car up and given it a paint job, we're going to take it to Crow Valley and I'm going to see if I can get this car to absolutely destroy the track record. Let's just see. Okay, so here is the car that we're looking at. It's rather elderly, a little bit sick Skeletrix Brabham. It's actually fundamentally a very nice car. Now, I went digging through the box of all the old car parts and I found this car in the box. It was only £5 and I thought, that is a fantastic car, ideal for what I want, but it's a pity that it was missing its air scoop. So I had a little bit of a dig around in the box that this car was in, because it was in a box about the size of this map with probably about 20 other cars. And right in the bottom of the box, I found this. And I thought, that's a strange piece of plastic, but I wonder. I went digging a little bit more and I found this. And then I thought, oh, I wonder if these two bits fit. And lo and behold, they actually did fit together. And then I thought, I wonder if they fit on the car. And they do. So I actually found the entire scoop. Sadly, I didn't have the forethought to keep digging to try and find the wing. I just was happy to find the car like this. So I bought the car and then I had to go and start looking for parts around the show. So, like you do, I stopped off at Pendle Slot Racing stand and he had a whole pile of these rear wings for the Brabham. So, for a few pence, I bought a wing and now I've got a complete car. That's really cool. So, I've got a complete car, but I don't really have any really high quality parts, and these tyres are most certainly well past their best. So, still looking on the Pendle Slot stand, I found these. Now, this is a full set of classic Formula 1 wheels and tyres, front and rear obviously, and these are really, really high quality tyres, really high quality wheels, and they're the exact fit for this car, the exact replacement. So these are going to replace the wheels on this car. They're very, very high quality indeed, and we're also going to use these wheel centres to go in those wheels. So we'll be chopping up these wheels to use them for the insides of these alloy wheels. So that is my alloy wheels, front and rear, all sorted out. Incredibly high quality rubber and high quality wheels. And obviously we're going to need something to put those wheels on. So I've got a pair of very good quality axles. I believe these are all slot axles. I can't quite remember. They're just good quality, high quality axles that I found from my stash, again from Pendle Slot. And then I've got this tube. So this tube is going to go on the front of that car like that, and I'm going to do my trick of popping a solid tube in the front to stop all this ridiculous wibble wobble, and also I'm going to try and slam the front of this car all the way down to try and get a really low centre of gravity. So that is all my axles sorted out. So the next thing we're going to do is they're going to fit this great big motor. Now, I'm pretty sure that the old motor that's in this car is probably slow and tired. But this car, this motor here, this is not going to be slow and it's not going to be tired. Again, this came from Pendle Slot. They were very cheap at the time, so I grabbed one of these. I think they're about £6.50 at the time, so about $7. Now, I think with a little bit of finessing, I can get this nice powerful long can motor into this car. Now obviously there's not a lot of room here to add weight. I could put a bit of lead down the side, but it's going to be difficult to fit in the body. So a heavier motor is really going to help. So that is the motor all sorted out as well. Now, like I said, I want to get the centre of gravity all the way down on this car. So my next trip was over to Staff's, the Staff's stand at the show. And I've got these offset bearings. Now these are 1mm offset bearings, and that is going to lower the whole car down by 1mm on the back end and help to lower that centre of gravity all the way down. But of course, if I do that, I'm going to have problems with the gears. So back to pendulum slot racing, and I've got this 1mm offset slotted gear on a 27 tooth. It's in brass, so that will actually allow me to drop the axle down 1mm and still have the correct mesh on the gear. So that's all that sorted out. And then staying at the pendulum slot stand, I've got one of these little packets containing my most favourite Slotting Plus guide and all the other little bits to go with it. So there's a spacer in there, there's some eyelets, nice bit of silicone wire, and obviously the all important and my favourite Slotting Plus guide. And then I went onto eBay when I got back home and I got these. Now these came from the exact same eBay seller that I did that 1275 GT Mini, and they were really good. So I've got these to go on this car because I was very impressed with the set the first time round. So I think we'll be absolutely good to go with these as well, and these are going to really freshen up the car and make it look the business as well. So with all these parts here going in that little car, I think we're going to be able to turn that car into a little bit of a monster. So let's get to the bench and let's see how this all pans out. Okay, so let's get this party started on this poor, unsuspecting 1970s Skeletrix Brabham. So as you can see, it's got very old gear in it. It's probably quite tired at this point, although would probably still work. These back tyres are as hard as nails, so they're definitely not going to do the business. So there's no point in doing some track testing on this car before we go, because it's only going to be completely disastrous. And as you can see, the driver already agrees with me because he's already bailed on us. So that's that piece done. So let's just take out all these little parts and get us back to a standard chassis. And honestly, this is not going to take very long, and it's not going to be very difficult because these things come apart as easy as that. Right, so just for good measure, we'll pop this out as well, although we do want to use this at a later date. So let's carefully pop that out without breaking off those little ears. So there we are. Right, so there is the basic chassis all stripped down while I'm talking to you. Oh, sorry, forgot that. Right, now it's the basic chassis. So the next thing to do, I think, probably, is to see how we go with fitting this motor. Now, these are really nice motors. They're on special offer at the moment. I don't know why, but they come with a 9-tooth pinion already fitted and some very nice silicone wire. So I'll keep all that lot in place. So now what we need to do is just work out whether this motor is even going to fit in the chassis, and it is going to fit. As you can see, it's pretty close there, but it fits. But we've got a bit of a gap on the back. Now I think maybe it's a little bit close, so it does kind of fit, although both of the bushings on either end of the cam are both a little bit too big for the apertures that we've got here, which is good because it saves us some hassle. So what we now need to do is just try and ascertain whether that motor pinion is the correct distance out the back of that motor back plate, so to speak. So if I pop these bearings in, hang on, let me just fight with these bearings for a minute. Okay, so because these are eccentric bearings, take a little bit of work to get them in the right place because they want to sort of swing around. So I've got the bearing in the uppermost, or the hole in the uppermost position on both sides. And now we can just clip those into the chassis like that. I've got them pretty good actually because that axle is nice and free. So that's not really my main point of concern for the minute. My main point of concern is just making sure that that axle on the motor isn't going to hit the gear, the axle on the actual car axle, and it's not. So let's just try now fitting this gear as well, and we'll see if that gear is going to work in the car, because that is another thing that I haven't actually tested yet. So if I pop that on there,
And right, it's going to be a little bit tight, so I'm going to have to just shave a little bit because I want to run those bearings in the uppermost position to lower the whole car down. That's obviously changed the size of that gear. Now really what you could do is you could come down to a smaller gear. Now this is a 27 tooth gear, so if I came down to something like a 26 tooth gear, that would probably fit. But the problem then is that you would end up with quite a tall gear ratio, so the acceleration would be a little bit compromised, but the top end would be really good. You can even that out with a different size pinion, but then you're having to come down on the size of pinions, and there's only a limit to how far down you can come. This one's already a 9 tooth, so you'd have to come down to something like a 7 tooth, which I don't like running them that small because the gaps between the teeth can make them a bit lumpy. So I think we're only a fraction out here. So I think what we'll first do now is we'll just Dremel a little bit in this chassis just to get this gear to fit. And if I end up having to go through the chassis, it's no great loss because with the wing on the back, it's going to cover it up. So that'll be fine. So let's crack on and let's put a little clearance in there just so that we can get our gear in, and then we can come back to the motor. Okay, so after a couple of passes, I'm pretty sure I'm very, very close. But I'm not entirely sure that the gear is lined up with the center of the motor shaft, even though the gear is free to turn. I think it's just catching on the side of the plastic. So what I'll do, I'll get some Sharpie here now, and I'll just color the edge of that gear in Sharpie, and then I'll push the gear tight against that body, and I'll rub that gear around, and that should transfer that Sharpie to where it's catching on the body. And as you can see, it has done. So I'm going to nibble a little tiny bit more plastic away from there, being very careful not to go through the body, and then we'll come back to getting the motor fitted. Okay, so a little bit more dremeling, and I'm now happy that I've got good clearance. The gear is free to turn in the little pocket that I've rebaited out, and if I put this blade right over to the side of that motor mount there, you can see it's really close, and if I do the same on the other side, that's fine. So somewhere in the middle I've got really good clearance, and I've got clearance over here as well, and I'm too close to the other side of the car, if you can see. So somewhere in amongst that middle piece there, I've got a good amount of clearance. So I'm happy with my gear fitment, so we can now dump that over there for a minute. Now we need to turn our attentions back to trying to fit the motor. Now, as I said earlier on, this can is a little bit bigger on the ends than the hole that we've got. So that's basically 6.1 mil. I'm not sure if we can really measure that. Well, yeah, we probably can. There we are. So that's 5 millimeters. So we need to open this up to basically 6 millimeters. And then on the back end, what sort of deal we got there? It's exactly the same size. And the back end on here is exactly the same size. Right, so that's fine. But also, as I said to you earlier on, I've got a bit of a gap on the back of this motor here. Now that gap is approximately, by eye, 2 millimeters. So what I'll do is I'll just test that with a drill. Okay. So here we got a 2 mil drill, and as I suspected, it's absolutely perfect. So we know that that gap is a 2 mil gap there. So I've actually got some 2 millimeter plastic card, which is handy. So what I'll do is I will open up this hole to 6 mil, so it's a nice fit in the front of the motor. I'll overlay a piece of 2 millimeter plastic card onto the face of this motor mount, and then I'll drill out this hole here to 6 mil, including the piece of plastic that I'm going to glue all in place. And that should, in theory, get our motor seated nicely. If it does catch on the bottom a little tiny bit, I can always just do a little tiny bit of dremeling just down here, but I don't think that's going to be necessary. Right, so let's cut this plastic out and get this motor fitted. Okay, so that's it with all the chopping and hacking and trimming, and I've now got the motor to fit. And as you saw, I put a few little dots around those openings there just as a guide, and I did end up taking a little tiny bit of plastic just from these little side pieces here. It was only a few thou, just enough to stop the motor from binding. And as you also saw, I used this reaming tool that happens to be just over 6mm wide, and I was able to pop that in the hole and then use the back of it to guide up in the other engine mount. And by using my pliers, I was able to sort of grind it through and finish off the last little bit of grinding just to get those holes nice and central. And now when you fit the motor in, it fits in there and in there. Nice reassuring clip, and it's in there now as well as the original motor was. So all we now need to do is work out how long that motor shaft needs to be. So as you can see, with the axle in there, the motor shaft is just touching. So now I'm going to trim down the end of that motor shaft so that I can now get my gear in there, and the back of the motor, or the end of the motor shaft, gives me the correct clearance for that gear, so it all fits in properly like that, as we all know and expect. Right, so a little trick that I use to get my motor in exactly, or the motor shaft exactly the right length, is I like to put my motor onto a small little battery like this one, spin it up, and I put a little grinding disc on my Dremel on the end, and I keep going back and forth, taking a little bit off, testing it until it's exactly the right size. And I will do that now. Okay, so that's the whole drivetrain all fitted and finished. And as you saw, I did actually fit an axle stopper to the axle, because I know that some of you guys don't like me running the end of that motor shaft against the brass bush, because over time it can wear against the brass. So the axle stopper just prevents that. And in the interest of full disclosure, I did end up changing that pinion gear to an 8-tooth pinion gear. This one just here. So it's a slotted 8-tooth 5.5mm gear, because I decided that the gear ratio on this car will be more favourable with a smaller pinion, because it does have rather large wheels, and this is a 22,000 RPM motor, so a 9 on a 27 would be quite high at 3:1, so this is more like 3.4:1, just to slow the gearing down a little bit, because I think this car isn't going to want for speed. So if we put some power to the drivetrain, you get that. Needs a little bit of oil, but it all works absolutely perfectly. Right, so now the back end is done, we can turn our attentions to the front guide. Okay, so I did say the next job is to fit the guide, but having looked at this car in great detail, I've decided that we ought to really fit the front axle tube. Now, the axle tube I am going to be selling with a sticker on my website, and the link for that is just there if you're interested. However, so we need to fit this tube really, and I need to make sure that the chassis is nice and square. Now, by pure coincidence, I've worked it out that these two M6 nuts balanced on the end of those that rear axle is exactly the right height, where those back tyres just catch the setup plate. Now, the back tyres are actually slightly different sizes, so they will need to be trued at the end to get them exactly right, which is why I should not wanting to set up this chassis off the tyres, because the tyres are not a reliable source of measurement, but these nuts absolutely are. I've measured them, they're exactly the same diameter each, and for those that are interested, this is an M6 nut, and it's actually 9.81mm, so that gives me the exact right height to get those back tyres evenly spaced. Now, obviously sets the car up nice and level, and the front wheels are held on by these M10 nuts, and that gives me just the right amount of front wheel or tyre slip, but there's still a good amount of movement vertically, because I do need to allow for my tube in a moment. So those M10 nuts are perfect as well, and for those that are interested, the thickness of that is 7.77mm. So that gives me the exact spacing that I want. Obviously, if you set the car up on the back axle and then balanced on the front on the guide, that will give you a perfectly flat chassis. So this is the thing. If I turn this over, those big nuts will disappear because they're under no tension. hopefully you can see underneath there, the bottom of the motor is actually sitting on a 1mm drill, and that's given me exactly the right amount of height. And as you can see on the front, I've got exactly the right amount of ground clearance I want. I've already done all the workings out on this. So the guide itself was underneath that car all along, and it's absolutely perfect. But we can come back to the guide actually afterwards, because the guide isn't really our problem at all. We've got loads of adjustment for the guide. And there is that 1mm drill that I put underneath the car. So if I put that all back together again without the front guide, we're going to get exactly the same result with or without the guide. So there we are. So that's that there. And as you can see, that is still nice and free to move. There's still a good amount of vertical movement in that axle to allow for the tube. And the back end is still obviously exactly where it should be. Those back tires are just catching the setup plate. This one is a little bit smaller, but the nuts are keeping it exactly level. Now if I obviously going to lose that nut again, but if I move it, and that one, but if I move it again, and that one in fact, so let's pop them all back again so we can actually see what we're doing. So with those there, I put a bit more pressure on the back, we can now see that the height is absolutely perfect and exactly where I want it. It's taken me a few minutes to work all this out, but just run with it, it's correct. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this front axle from its wheels, just there. And what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to file these slots so that actually I'm not going to need to do that, am I? That looks... okay, so I'm going to ease those slots just a little bit so that tube will fit in there nicely. Then I'm going to scratch up this area of the chassis here, get it nice and scratched, and I'm also going to scratch up the middle of this tube. And I should put some car body filler in the middle of there, or Bondo if you prefer. And I'm going to put the axle tube onto the axle. I'm going to embed the axle into that, and then I'm going to pop it back on the setup plate and then set it back up on these nuts, having removed the back tires, because the back tires, I want them completely out the picture and not causing me any interferences at all. And I don't need the front wheels on this axle either, so we can remove those wheels as well. Okay, so I let that car body filler set up for about an hour and a half. And now you can see that front axle is completely solid. So once the axle was bonded in, I was then able to go ahead, true up all the tyres and get them all perfect, and then cut the axles to length using the original length of the original axles, obviously front and rear. And then I was able to fit all the wheels and axles back into the car. Now there's one thing that I forgot to mention when I was setting up that front axle tube, and that is to make sure, obviously, that that front axle tube is exactly in the middle of the chassis. And it's quite easy to work that out because the end of the tube falls exactly at the end of that front or that top suspension strut, just there. It's just a happy coincidence. It's exactly in line. So once you've got that obviously set up, then you can go ahead and let that filler set up. Right, so now that axle is completely done, or the axles are completely done, we can now move ahead and fit the guide. Now it's quite a straightforward process from this point on. Now, by some happy coincidence, this car's full of coincidences, the length of that tube hits the underside of that body at exactly the same time as those front wheels land perfectly on the setup plate. That is exactly where we would want it if we were setting the car up. But obviously, we got no room there for braid or for a screw. So what we need to do is we need to trim a little bit of that tube off to fit the screw. Now, I'm lucky because I have a Swift Slots reaming guide for these Slotting Plus guides. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to put a tube in the front of this guide holder so I can ream out all of that plate and get it absolutely perfect. But if you haven't got one of these reamers, it doesn't matter, it's not important. So let me just pop a tube in here and ream it out, and then we'll go back to setting up the guide. So as you saw, if you've got one of my reaming tools, you can simply ream out the old Scalextric guide, fit a new liner in there, and you've got an absolutely perfect fitting Slotting Plus guide with absolutely no wobble whatsoever. Yeah, it's very, very smooth to turn. So once we've got that reamed out, we can fit that back in the car, and then we can start thinking about getting it all set up for ride height. Okay, so fitting the guide. Now, as I said earlier on in the video, that mounting tube there is exactly the right length. So when it hits the underside of the body, it sets the front of the car up perfectly. So if we turn the back wheels, you can see the front tyres turning, but they're also very free to turn. Now, that's exactly where we need to be once the guide is fitted, but not now, because there's nowhere for the screw to go and there's nowhere for the braid to go. So talking of braid, this little kit that Pendle Slots sell comes with a very nice piece of braid. Now, there's nothing wrong with this braid, but it is 0.3 of a mil. Now, I find this braid is a little bit heavy for light cars. It's okay for 1/24th, but for light cars like the 132, I find it a little bit stiff, and it tends to want to keep the front of the car up, which is not really what we want. So what I like to use is the 0.2 braid. This is, you can get it tinned and untinned, and this is tinned, and this is from NSR, and it's 0.2 of a mil. And I find this doesn't influence the front of the car at all because it's so thin and so light. It makes really good contact, but it doesn't lift the front of the car off the track. So I need to allow for a bit of 0.2 braid. Now, also in the pack of the guide, you get this little spacer set. Now, one of those spacers is about 1.8 mil, and the other one is about 1.3 mil, 1.3.5, something like that. Now, this guide, now we know it's exactly the right height without any screw in the top or braids. There's a little tiny gap just down in there. Now, this is a 1.2 mil drill. So if I put that in the gap, if you listen, you can hear that little snap. That means that this guide is being held off of its maximum depth position using this 1.2 mil drill. So there's probably a 1.1 mil gap underneath that guide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fit my 0.2 mil braid, and I'm going to also fit this 1.35 spacer, the smallest one, and I'm going to trim the top of that tube, and I'm going to do it all together in sympathy. So as the tube rises on the chassis, I will use the thickness of that thin shim, and I will control the thickness by sanding it on a piece of paper so I can control the height that this guide sinks up into the chassis. And as it goes up with thinning that spacer, I'll trim the top of that tube to suit, so that by eye, when I look through that body and I don't know if you can see it through the camera. Yes, you can. Just there, that tube there needs to end up being at the top of this guide holder, giving me enough room for my screw to go up in that gap as well. So let me just do it all and I'll show you when it's finished. So that's the guide all fitted with the wires neatly tucked away underneath the chassis, and I like to leave a little bit of extra wire just for any eventualities, and also you can leave a nice big loop underneath the guide so the guide isn't straining those wire joints at the front, because they can fatigue after a while. And as you can see, I got a little tiny bit of drop there. I got a healthy loop underneath the front of the car that's not getting in the way, and I got good clearance all the way around. And I did have to just nibble away just the corners of that guide block just so that I could get full lock to lock without it snagging, because it just caught a fraction. And when you put the car on the setup plate and you move the back tires, the front wheels are free to turn. Hopefully that's showing up there, but they're also very free to spin on their own as well, which means they're just touching the track, which is exactly where you want this guide to be. So there we are, one last look. So there we are. So that is basically the chassis completely finished and ready to run as a slot car again. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn these wheels into inserts, and I'll show you how I do that simply on an electric drill and a Dremel. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get yourself a pair of digital calipers and measure the inside diameter of your alloy wheels, and then apply that dimension to your plastic wheels just to get an idea of how much plastic has got to be removed. Then simply pull off the plastic wheel off of the standard Skeletrix axle and push the wheel onto the offcut of your high performance axle, and then simply put it into your electric drill and do up the chuck nice and tight. Push the wheel firmly on the axle and make sure that everything is good to go. Then simply take a very coarse sanding drum on your Dremel and carefully and slowly wipe the surface of the wheel, removing as little plastic as possible to keep the heat down. You may decide that halfway through the job you might want to dip the wheel in a bit of water, or just stop for 5 minutes to let the wheel cool down. And then periodically just check the diameter on your digital gauge just to make sure that you're still heading in the right direction. It's also worth occasionally offering it up to the car's wheel itself just to make sure that it's all heading in the right direction. And then when you're very close, so we think you're almost there, take some rough sandpaper and then just sand the outside of the wheel with the rough sandpaper just for that last final hone. And you should find the insert will push into the wheel with just the right amount of interference fit. Once you've got the insert fitting onto the wheel, you can go ahead and pop the wheel back into your drill, and then with a scalpel start making a cut around the outside of the wheel. Be careful not to make the cut a bit off center, as it might grab and snap the blade. Then once you've parted off the wheel, either in the jaws of the drill or pushing down with your hand, you can then sand the back of the insert until all the little tags are very thin, and you can simply push them out with a cocktail stick. Then you can go around the outside of the wheel on the back with a scalpel and just clean off all the little tags of plastic that haven't been sanded off to give you a nice sharp look on the back of the wheel. And then once all the tags are cleaned off, you can simply push your nice shiny new insert into your alloy wheel and admire your work. Now I like the look of this wheel with the silver rim, so that's how it's staying on my car, but you could go ahead at this point and paint whatever alloy wheel is still showing. Guys, I just thought I'd stop this painting montage to show you this body whilst it's still in primer. Now I've said this before on my channel, but look at the quality of the tooling of this body whilst it's in white primer. Now bearing in mind this tooling was made during the 70s. Just look at the detail that they put in the 70s. those Ford logos. Now I know it's not 100% accurate, but just look at the quality and the attention to detail. Once you get rid of all those tampos and the unrealistic paint jobs that Scalextrics were putting on their cars in the day, and you just go back to the raw basic casting in some decent quality primer, you can really see the attention to detail, and it all gets lost when they put on their decals and paintwork of the day. It's such a shame because there's such a lot of nice detail hidden underneath their old decoration. But you know, I just thought I'd show that because I really think it's worth pointing out again on this channel, although I've said it before, but it really is very, very good. Right, okay, let's get back onto painting this car. Okay, so that's the body all painted, just need to fit the rear wing, and that is the running gear all fitted, all turning very smoothly, ready to hit the track. Now there's just one last thing I'd like to do to this car before I call it finished, and that is to fit the rear view mirrors. Now this car never came with rear view mirrors, as you may know, but also you may know that I've just bought myself a 3D printer and I'm learning how to use it. I bought the special nozzle to be able to print very, very fine parts, and I've created these two sets of rear view mirrors, and they're in the classic bullet style. This size is 3mm and this size is 2.75mm, and as you can see there's enough mirrors on each tree to do 4 cars, and these are actually now available on my website. There's a little picture just there for them. So let's just go through now. Let's get these cut off the sprue and fitted to my car, and I'm going to use the 2.75mm size for my Brabham. So let's crack on, let's get these mirrors fitted, and then we can hit the track.
So there you are, a 47.7. Not quite the track monster I wanted it to be, but still incredibly respectable for what is effectively a 40-year-old car. And the only thing that holds this car back is just sheer back end grip. She came off the bench at 75 grams. I had to add 10 grams of weight, which brought her out to 85 grams, and that really picked up the handling and gave me the grip and stability that I was looking for. So if you drive this car aggressively, it gets a bit unhappy and a bit unstable, but if you drive it very smoothly, it goes really quickly, and you can definitely see it in the way that it runs and the track time it returns. And I do a lot of sim racing, and we race this car on the sim, and that's exactly how the real car on the simulator handles. You drive it aggressively, it's all over the place. You drive it smooth, and it's really quick. So I really like this car. I think it goes really well, and I think it looks really good. And on the note of looking good, if you wanted to buy these rear view mirrors, don't forget I sell them on my website, link below. And if you wanted to buy the little brass tube on the front to stiffen up the front end, again, link below. So I hope that you've enjoyed this sort of content, and if you have, maybe you'll subscribe. And if you could hit the little bell button, that would be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.